Picture this: the road is full of smoke, a car is on fire, and inside is an elderly black woman desperately fighting for her life. But what does a police officer do? He stands by, cold-bloodedly watching what is happening. Every second is worth its weight in gold, but help does not come. The tension is growing, the situation is becoming more and more terrible. What would you do in his place? Write your name and where you watch us from in the comments. This is very important to us. You help our channel grow, and we are sincerely grateful to each of you for your support. You are truly valuable to us and your contribution is invaluable. We do this together with you and your activity helps promote our content. You are our inspiration. Enjoy watching. A quiet evening had settled over the city, the air thick with a sense of foreboding, yet still peaceful. A routine shift for Sergeant Marks, a longtime cop trusted to patrol the streets. His reputation had long been tainted by racist comments, taunts about people of color, but no one dared to argue. Many of his colleagues turned a blind eye to his actions, because at first glance he was a conscientious servant of the law. Marks drove through the deserted streets, slowing slightly around areas where he thought nothing decent lived. He looked down on the homes of poor black families, thinking about how people like them were ruining the city. But the evening promised nothing out of the ordinary. The very people he despised were quiet. Marks felt comfortable in his control of the space. As he passed another intersection, his gaze caught on a lone figure on the sidewalk, an elderly black woman crossing the street with a slow, tired gait. Marks didn't pay much attention to her. She was just another face in the crowd, useless and unnoticeable. He drove on, lost in his thoughts. The silence of the night, the dark streets, everything seemed ordinary, routine, but the calm was deceptive. A moment later, a deafening roar cut through the air. Something happened ahead. A car crashed into a pole and turned over. Thick smoke poured out from under the hood. The impact was so sharp that even Marks flinched, though his reaction quickly turned to dull irritation. In front of him, a few dozen meters away, stood an overturned car, black smoke pouring out. The air immediately smelled of burning metal and plastic. Marks slowed down and sighed in displeasure, as if this incident were just an inconvenience that had disrupted his peaceful evening. The car lay on its side, covered in twisted metal, and the engine was starting to catch fire. A few more minutes and the flames would engulf everything around it. Marks could have called for backup right away, reported the fire, but he didn't. He stepped out of his patrol car slowly, deliberately, with lazy caution. His face remained cold and impassive. The incident did not cause him any fear or alarm. As he got closer, Marks noticed a silhouette inside the car. The driver was still alive. The dark skin of the older woman stood out in the light of his headlights. She was struggling to get out, but her seatbelt and the upturned doors kept her trapped. Her movements were slow, desperate, and she was breathing hard, coughing from the smoke that had already filled the car. For a moment, their eyes met. The woman's eyes were filled with immense panic, pleading with her gaze, asking for help. But instead of rushing to the car and trying to save her, Marks only stopped and stood still. He raised an eyebrow slightly, as if assessing the situation. A thought sounded in his head, which he did not say out loud. Again nothing but trouble from these people. Marks was in no hurry. A cold contempt flared up in his soul, mixed with the racist disdain he felt every time he encountered black people. To him, this woman was not a person, but a symbol of everything he hated in this city. The flames flaring up around her were no reason to hurry. It was an opportunity to watch her life slowly fade away, as if it were worthless. The woman began to pound her fist on the window, her scream coming out, hoarse and terrified. But to Marks, it was just an annoying soundtrack. Idly, he pulled out his radio, not to call the fire department, but simply to do something. His indifference to her suffering underscored the racial hatred that was inside him. This life meant nothing to him. "Help, please," came the woman's barely audible voice, carried through the crackling fire. Marks could have walked over and opened the door, cut the belt. It would have taken only a few minutes, but instead, he turned away for a moment, looked back at the car, watching the flames creep across its hull. He felt like he was in control, and that this woman was just part of the problem, the same problem he saw every day. Through the smoke and crackling flames, Marks felt the adrenaline rush through his body, not from fear or compassion, but from cold satisfaction. He watched the scene like a spectator at a cheap, pointless show, The fire engulfing the car was a mesmerizing spectacle, and he didn't care that inside was a living person fighting for his life. The woman continued to pound on the glass desperately, her eyes full of fear, but Marks only looked at her with a puzzled expression. He shrugged, as if to say, "So what?" There was no room for sympathy inside his hardened heart. Every instinct in him told him that this situation was not worth his time. For a moment he just stood there, looking at the burning car, enjoying the fact that he was in control of the moment. His mind raced about how this woman had probably caused a lot of trouble in her life. He thought of the petty crimes he had heard about from his colleagues, how people like her always caused trouble. He didn't care about her story, her pain, or her dreams. Then, as the fire began to consume the salon, Marks felt his position becoming untenable. He could have called the fire brigade, but for some reason he hesitated. Unconsciously, he felt he was doing the right thing by ignoring her suffering. In his mind, she had become a symbol of everything he hated: helplessness, dependency, failure. Even though his only duty was to protect and serve, he couldn't shake the feeling of superiority that the humiliated woman inside the car gave him. He began to joke to himself, imagining how this situation might look in the light of the news: a hero cop who saved another problem. At that moment, the woman's screams began again, louder and more panicked. They expressed not only physical pain, but also complete despair. She clearly realized that there would be no help, and this feeling was depressing. "Please," her voice became thin, as if all her energy was leaving the air, along with her last hopes. "I can't." Marks rolled his eyes, almost grinning. In his mind, there were thoughts that it was none of his business. He knew that no one cared about her suffering. There were no witnesses on the street, no cameras, no one would see his inaction. He could just go back to his patrol and forget about this problem as if it never existed. He opened the radio only to say, "Everything is fine. There was a minor incident." The words he had spoken made an even more vile impression. Marks looked again at the burning car, in which the woman was still struggling for life. The fire was consuming her, turning everything into something terrible, and he stood aside, not having the slightest intention of interfering. Inside the burning car, darkness and terror reigned. The elderly black woman, who had once been full of life, was now trapped. Every movement was difficult. Every inspiration brought searing pain. Her hand, trapped by the seatbelt, felt the metal squeeze tighter with each attempt to escape. Her heart pounded in her chest, as if it wanted to escape along with her fear. She tried to concentrate, but panic engulfed her mind, tearing her thoughts apart. She thought of her grandchildren, how they used to come to visit her, how they would laugh and share stories. Thinking about them gave her strength. But now, in this horrible hell, she felt like she would never see them again. Every time she knocked on the glass, her breathing became more labored. The flames had already engulfed the front panel, and she could feel the heat seeping in. Her eyes filled with tears from fear, pain, and despair. She closed them for a moment, hoping that when she opened them again, this would all be just a bad dream. But when she opened her eyes again, there was only a grim sight before her. The car was still burning, and the policeman, instead of coming to the rescue, stood to the side, as if watching the show. The woman felt a growing anxiety overwhelm her, and her voice, filled with suffering, burst out, "Help me, please!" A cry full of despair escaped her throat, but instead of sympathy she received only silence. Her thoughts raced, trying to find a way out. She tried to straighten her shoulders, but the belt was too tight. The fire was slowly but surely moving towards her, and with each passing second the heat became unbearable. She knew that time was running out. The woman began to think that her whole life, her suffering and joy, all those years spent caring for her family, could end in this burning metal. How could she have ended up in this situation? How unfair! All these thoughts were mixed with anger at the policeman who was obliged to help, but instead only watched. Every attempt to escape resulted in another blow to her body. Every second became a test. She didn't even know how it happened. Could she even deserve such a fate? Powerlessness and humiliation squeezed her heart, and she began to pray quietly. Her words were addressed to anyone: God, fate, the universe, as long as someone would hear her. Marks, standing aside, didn't understand the depth of her suffering. He didn't want to know her story. To him, she was just another problem to leave behind. Instead, his thoughts revolved around the things he could say when this shit was over. He was sure no one would ever know what happened here. Inside the car, the darkness was filling the space more and more. and with each passing minute it was becoming more and more difficult to breathe. The woman felt despair begin to overcome her, but even in the most terrible moment, when the fire began to penetrate her body, she could not allow herself to give in. Officer Marks leaned against his patrol car, his expression filled with indifference and amusement. He watched the elderly black woman desperately trying to escape the burning car, and a smirk crossed his face. It was a feeling so familiar to him, a sense of superiority that arose whenever he encountered people he despised. Every scream, every movement she made only emphasized his hatred. In his mind, she became the embodiment of everything he disliked in this world. Trouble from people like her again, he thought, watching her struggle. Images appeared in his head. She behaved like a typical useless woman who couldn't even cope with a simple situation. As the fire began to spread, engulfing her legs, the woman sobbed softly in pain. Marks, however, was relentless. There was no pity or compassion in his eyes. Instead, he felt his hatred for her and her race grow. She could have been my grandmother, he thought, but his thoughts were not filled with love. They were filled with contempt. "Why can't you just get out?" he said with a slight grin, though his words didn't reach her ears. "Are you too old for this or something?" At that moment, he felt like he was in control. Every word he spoke was dripping with contempt, and he relished it. He wondered how long it would take her to realize that help wasn't coming. He began to wonder how it would look on the news. Policemen stood by while black woman burned alive, but in his mind, it didn't make him feel guilty. Rather, it gave him strength. He was on the side of power, and she was just a victim. There was terror in her eyes, but he didn't notice. All he saw was her humiliation and suffering. She was weak, helpless, and that underscored his own sense of power. He knew he had power over her life, and it filled him with a malicious satisfaction. The woman, feeling his gaze on her, gathered her strength to look at him. There were tears in her eyes, but also fearlessness. She could not let him break her spirit. In that moment, with the world burning around her, she decided that she would not burn with her hopes. Her thoughts were torn between fear and anger. "I won't die here," she said, barely audible, trying to find the strength within herself. She wasn't going to leave without a fight. A flame of hope burned within her, even if the circumstances outside seemed hopeless. However, despite her determination, Marks only smirked, believing that her weakness was predetermined. Why does she even keep trying? He thought, enjoying her torment while the real hell was raging around them. There was no room for pity in his head, only endless contempt for the woman who, in his opinion, had no right to be saved. The fire was creeping faster and faster through the car, turning it into a hellish flame, where even the air seemed poisonous. The elderly black woman, breathing with difficulty, tried to find a way out of her trap, but with each new breath her strength was depleted. The heat from the flames burned her skin, and she understood that time was running out. Each breath brought unbearable pain and oppression, but in her heart there remained a spark of hope. Through all the torment, her thoughts wandered to her grandchildren, their laughter and the tenderness they gave her. She wanted to see them again, to feel their love, but now it seemed an unattainable dream. How could she leave them alone in this world? She could not accept that her life would end here, in this burning car, under the indifferent gaze of a policeman. Every attempt to escape was a real battle. She began to pound on the glass again, trying to draw attention to her situation, but it turned out to be useless. Marks remained on the sidelines, still as before, his eyes expressing only cold contempt. He watched her struggle with the fire and her fears, but instead of helping, he only enjoyed her suffering. "It's too late, old woman," he said quietly, as if making a remark to himself. "You'll die and no one will notice." As if in response to his cruel thoughts, the fire began to engulf her legs, and that was the last straw. The woman felt a wave of despair mixed with anger growing inside her. She could no longer simply watch her fate. Each new gust of heat made her realize that she could actually die. Unwilling to give in, she pulled one last time on the seatbelt. She knew this was her last chance. There had to be a force that would burst from her heart. At that moment, all her fears and pains came together in a single impulse. She gritted her teeth and pulled like she never had before, until the belt gave way and she was able to free herself. But the joy of liberation was short-lived. The fire had already burned her legs, and she struggled out of the car, sprawled on the hot asphalt. Her head was spinning, and she could barely stand up. The neighboring houses were burning, and the smell of burning plastic and gasoline hung in the air. The old woman turned around, seeing the fire consuming her only home, her car, her place where she was safe. Her heart sank as she saw the policeman standing there with an expression of mockery and indifference. Marks had no intention of intervening. He stood aside, as if waiting for her to fall completely, so that he could confirm his preconceived notions. "You can't save yourself," he whispered with a smirk, feeling his inner contempt for her only growing stronger. These words sank into her soul like a final blow. She knew that she did not have the strength to rise, but inside her, the flame of struggle still burned. She could not let it break her. Even on the brink of death, there was a determination in her heart that gave her the strength to breathe and try to move on, despite the despair and fear. The woman clutched the hot asphalt in her hands, trying to rise. A storm was brewing inside her, fear and anger fighting with hope. She was ready to fight to the end. The fire and inequality she had faced in this life would not break her. With every step, with every new movement, she understood that her story would not end here. She was ready to overcome this test, even if it cost her her life. The fire around her continued to blaze, turning every moment into a hellish ordeal. The elderly black woman, dripping with sweat and tears, mustered all her will to continue fighting for her life. Her weak and twitching legs could barely hold her up, but deep down she knew that she could not give up. Every step was a struggle, and there was only one goal on the horizon: to get out of this fiery hell. She felt her strength draining, but she forced herself to move. Her chest tightened with heat, and her breathing became labored. Every breath brought the burning taste of smoke, and even in this terror, she could not allow herself to stop. Each step was filled with desperation, and her inner voice whispered, "You have to do this. You have to save yourself." Mark still stood to the side, watching her efforts. His cold gaze never left her alone, and with every step she took, a malicious joy blazed in his eyes. He wasn't just leaving her in trouble, he was enjoying her torment. His disdain was becoming more and more obvious, and he didn't hide his satisfaction as he watched the woman fight the fire. "You can't get out," he said, filling his words with sarcasm. "Why even try? No one will come to help." At that moment, the woman felt his words pierce her, as if someone had plunged a knife into her heart. She turned around, her eyes met his, and all her pain was reflected in them. There was not just hopelessness in her gaze, but a desire to resist, a desire to live. She could not allow this man to take away her hope. "You're wrong," she screamed, using the last of her strength to express her anger and defiance. "I won't give up. I'll fight." This cry was not only her last effort, but also a manifestation of her spirit that could not be broken. The crackling and hissing of fire was heard all around, but her words hung in the air, creating a contrast between the indifference of the policeman and her unbending will. She knew that she had to continue, despite his ridicule and indifference. Even though her legs were weak and her shoulders were slumped, she took another step. The fire was now touching her clothes, and she could feel the heat seeping inside. But the thought of her grandchildren, their joy, the way they looked at her with love and admiration, gave her strength. She thought of how they were eagerly waiting for her home, and that gave her courage. But Marks just chuckled as he watched her try to stumble, and then said, "No grandchildren will help you now. You are just a statistic that does not matter." His words, full of hatred, made her heart tremble once again, but deep down she knew that she would not be a statistic. She was a living person with a story, and her story would not end here, amidst fire and indifference. With each passing moment, despair and fear tried to overwhelm her, but she continued to clench her fists, deciding that even if she fell, she would do so with dignity. Each step became heavier, but her spirit burned brighter than the fire that surrounded her. "I'm leaving here," she whispered to herself, but this time it wasn't just a promise, it was a statement she couldn't afford to lose. And in this very despair, when it seemed that everything was already lost, she felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest again. It was the last spark she could muster to continue the fight for her life. With each passing second the heat grew stronger, and the flames, like a mad monster, devoured everything around them. The old black woman felt her strength leaving her, but at the same time a new flame was blazing inside her, the flame of struggle and determination. She struggled to lift her legs. Every cell in her body screamed for help, but her spirit remained unconquered. The fire pierced her body, taking away the last remnants of her strength. The woman understood that if she did not get out now, she would never see her grandchildren again. Thoughts about them became her guiding star, forcing her to continue. "I must live. I must fight." she repeated to herself, clenching her fists until they bled. She took another step, but at that moment she felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. The balance she had been trying to maintain collapsed, and she fell onto the hot asphalt, convulsing in pain. Her clothes were already starting to smolder, and she felt burns appearing on her skin. In that moment, she felt that her whole life, all her struggles had led her to this terrible moment, and yet she could not give up. Mark stood to the side, watching her suffer, his scornful smile widening. He wondered how much longer she could hold out. He didn't care about her suffering, he saw only an opportunity to exercise his power. He felt like he was in control of the situation, refusing to even approach her and offer help. "Why do you need this?" he shouted, enjoying her suffering. "You won't live to see the morning anyway." The woman raised her head and met his gaze. There was fear and anger in her eyes, but also courage. It was as if an energy had burst forth from deep within her that she never thought she could find. In that moment, she knew she couldn't let this man and this fire take away everything she loved. With the last of her strength, she rose to her knees and, ignoring the scorching heat, reached out to the nearest car, hoping that someone passing by could help her. But there was no one around to pay attention to her. The windows were closed, and people walked past as if it were the norm. She felt the indifference of the world pressing down on her like a heavy stone. "Help!" she screamed, her voice full of pain and fear, but also determination. She wasn't going to give up without a fight. But instead of an answer to her cries, there was only a cold wind that carried them away into nowhere. Marks only watched, enjoying this moment, full of humiliation and suffering. In his eyes, she was just a toy, of no importance. Still, determination grew in her soul. Even as her strength was ebbing, she remembered how she had fought all her life, for her family, for the future of her children. It reminded her that she could not simply be a victim. She was a mother, a grandmother, a woman with a story, and that story did not have to end in flames. Gathering all her strength, she rose to her feet again, as if she felt that life itself was supporting her. The fire licked her skin, but she could not allow herself to give in. The flame inside her burned brighter than the fire around her, and in that moment she decided that she would fight to the end. With each step she took, her confidence grew. She could hear her grandchildren whispering in her head, feeling their support even when she was alone. The fire, though merciless, became her catalyst, forcing her to fight to live. In that critical moment, she realized that she was not alone, that her love for her family gave her the strength to continue. And suddenly, in the midst of all this chaos and fear, she noticed a fire that burned not only around her, but inside her. It wasn't just a flame, it was her will to live. The flames consuming the car became not just a symbol of fear for the elderly woman, but also a catalyst for her inner strength. Every step, every breath was filled with incredible determination. She understood that life and death depended on her choice to give up or to continue to fight. The fire raged around her, but inside her a spark was igniting, capable of turning fear into hope. Her legs could barely support her, but she began to move forward, step by step, despite the unbearable pain. Mark stood around indifferently, his sinister grin only spurring her on. She hated him for not helping, but at the same time this hatred became fuel for her fight. "I won't let you win," she said, clenching her fists as if that would be her last strength. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise to herself. She turned to look at the flames flaring up behind her, and in that moment she felt the fear leave her. Instead, a new feeling arose in her heart, confidence. Every day of her life was full of struggle, and she knew that this time she would not give in so easily. With each new step, she left behind the fear and shame that had paralyzed her. The woman, bleeding and crying, looked at the policeman. His mocking gaze could not break her spirit, and this realization gave her strength. She remembered all the times when her strength was tested, every fight, every struggle for her family, for her place in this world. It was not just a physical test, it was a test of the spirit. With every second spent in this fiery hell, she became more and more confident that she would not only survive, but also triumph over her circumstances. She suddenly realized that the fire that surrounded her could not extinguish what was burning inside her. Marks, watching her efforts, began to feel his own confidence begin to waver. He had not expected this old woman to show such determination, but instead of coming over and helping, he became even more cruel. "You look terrible," he said with a smirk, enjoying her torment. "You're not going to continue, are you?" But her answer was to take another step. ignoring his ridicule. Every step she took was filled with determination. She knew she had to get out of this situation, to tell her story, to make her life matter, to show everyone that she was more than just a victim. As she watched the flames, she thought of her grandchildren. The images of their faces, full of smiles and joy, became her beacon in the darkness. Every time her strength was depleted, she imagined herself hugging them, laughing with them. This thought was what brought her back to her feet. Suddenly, when hope seemed to be fading, she saw a silhouette against the burning landscape. It was a figure that did not resemble Mark's. At first she thought it was just a trick of light and shadow, but then she realized it was another policeman, approaching, noticing her struggle. Her heart started beating faster. This could be her only chance for salvation. The woman felt a surge of strength, and, gathering the last of her energy, she screamed to attract attention to herself. "Help!" Her voice sounded with new strength, full of despair and hope. The police, the people who guarded the peace, had to come to the rescue. She believed that everything could still end well, that her story would not end amidst fire and indifference. With each new cry, she felt her will grow stronger, and the flame of fear gradually fade. The policeman's silhouette was slowly approaching, and each step seemed endless to the woman. The fire around her continued to rage, and the temperature grew, but now a spark of hope lit up in her heart. She continued to scream, as if her voice was the only means of fighting the unbearable chaos around her. "Help! I'm here!" Her words sounded desperate, but there was also a sense of resilience in them. She wasn't going to give up. The silhouette became clearer, and the woman realized that it was indeed another policeman. His face was serious, and he glanced quickly at Marks, who was still watching with indifference. The new policeman, noticing the flames and the terrible situation of the woman, changed his expression. Understanding flashed in his eyes. He realized that this was not just a spectacle, but a real human life on the brink of death. "Hey!" he shouted, pushing his way through the crowd that had gathered around him. "What's going on here?" At that moment, the fear and anger that had been gripping the woman's heart gave way to hope. She raised her hand with difficulty, pointing at the burning car, and shouted, "I'm trapped! I can't get out! Help me, please!" The policeman finally realized the scale of the tragedy. He quickly ran to her side and, seeing her battered body and burnt skin, he immediately sprang into action. His face contorted with excitement, and he shouted to the team, "Over here! We need help! Quickly!" Despite the flames and confusion, it was like a breath of fresh air. The woman felt a wave of relief wash over her as the policeman began to search her condition. He knew time was running out, and he acted quickly. "How much strength do you have?" he asked, trying to remain calm so as not to undermine her courage. I don't know," she gasped, her voice shaking with pain. "I'll do anything to get out." The policeman nodded, his face filled with determination. He knew their time was limited, and that every moment mattered. He turned to those around him. "Find something to break the glass, quickly!" Meanwhile, Marks, seeing that his indifference had not yielded any results, felt his confidence begin to fade. He could not believe that this old woman was still fighting for her life, and that someone had finally come to her aid. His gaze filled with anger, and he wanted to stop the rescue, but he knew that doing so was pointless. The woman, seeing people start to move, felt a new strength being born in her. She looked at the policeman who was trying to save her, and her spirit was reborn. In this situation full of despair and pain, she saw that life still had meaning. Soon other police officers came running towards her, carrying glass-breaking tools. They took up positions, and one of them, a young man with a determined look, raised a hammer. "Ready?" he shouted, and the others nodded as if this was their last chance. The moment the hammer struck the glass, time stood still. The glass cracked and the woman was overcome with a moment of anticipation. She closed her eyes, mentally preparing herself for what was to come. The flames continued to bite her legs, but now she knew that her salvation was near. The glass shattered and shards rained down outside. The policeman standing next to her immediately reached out and began to pull her out, pulling her out of the fiery inferno. Her body, weakening from the pain, gave a final push as he pulled her towards him. She felt the cold air meet her skin again, like a warm embrace that brought her back to life. And then, when she was finally free, her heart was filled with joy and relief. She did not know what would happen next, but one thing was clear: her life, despite all the suffering, did not end in this fiery hell. She stood up, leaning on her savior who was already ready to offer her help. And at that moment, when she realized that despite the cruelty and hatred that surrounded her, there was still kindness and humanity in the world, she looked into the eyes of the new policeman and felt her soul fill with hope. "Thank you," she whispered, and it was more than just words. It was an expression of gratitude for not abandoning her in her time of need. When the woman was free, her body felt relieved, but her spirit was still struggling. She knew that getting out of the burning car was only the first victory in her fight against the cruelty of the world. There were people around her, some of whom looked on with sympathy, while others remained indifferent, and this gave her the strength to realize how important it was not to give up. The confusion and adrenaline were still running high, but she saw a genuine desire to help in the eyes of the policeman who had saved her. He supported her as she struggled to her feet, and his confidence was like an electric charge. "Are you okay?" he asked, looking over her injured body. There was a concern in his voice that suggested he was not just doing his job, but genuinely cared about her. I don't know," she breathed, looking at her burned hands and realizing that the healing process would be long and difficult, but at the same time, she felt that her fight was just beginning. As soon as her feet touched the ground, she heard the sound of sirens. Emergency services had arrived on the scene. The woman looked at the police officer who had saved her. He nodded, and they both headed towards the ambulances that were already preparing to treat her. But at this moment Marks, who had been standing aside, could not remain indifferent. His indifference turned to rage, and he shouted to attract attention. "Hey, why are you saving her? She's a nobody. She's just an old woman." His words, full of hatred and prejudice, pierced the atmosphere like a knife. The woman froze, feeling fear creeping up on her again. She knew that his words reflected what she had experienced all her life. Her heart sank with pain and humiliation, but the flame of determination still burned inside. The policeman standing next to her turned sharply to Marks, his eyes full of anger, and he took a step forward, clearly ready to protect the woman from the verbal attack. "Shut up," he said with hatred. "You have no right to talk about her like that. She's a human being, and her life matters." Marks laughed, his laugh sinister and cold. He was enjoying the moment, full of power, and this power seemed to give him strength. "A human? She's nothing," he continued, increasing his aggression. "She's just a burden on society." The woman, standing on the edge, felt the pressure building again. Her inner voice screamed that she couldn't let this continue. She was here, alive, despite all the suffering, and that in itself was a victory. At that moment, a female rescuer approached them, quickly assessing the situation. She saw the tension between the policeman and Marks and intervened. "That's enough," she cried, turning to Marks. "If you can't be a man, get out of here." The rescuer's words were like a cold shower. Marks, realizing that he could no longer influence the situation, curled his lips and turned away, leading his dark thoughts away. His departure left tension in the air, but for the woman it was a moment of release. The policeman, supporting her, turned to the rescuer. "We need to get her to safety. She has serious burns." The woman nodded and they walked towards the ambulance. Every step was painful, but now it was a step towards healing. She felt her body shaking, but her spirit was determined. There was a crowd at the scene that had dispersed. Watching the scene, some people looked on with sympathy, while others simply walked away, unwilling to get involved. She realized that even at a time when her life depended on others, many people still remained indifferent. As she got into the ambulance, her eyes filled with tears, but they were not only tears of pain, but also tears of relief. Rescue had become a new beginning for her. She realized that her story was not over yet. New challenges lay ahead, and she was ready to meet them with an open heart. "Thank you for saving me," she said, turning to the policeman who was still nearby. "That's my job," he replied, but there was sincerity in his voice. "But honestly, you're a lot stronger than most of us." She looked at him and saw understanding and respect in his eyes. In that moment, a bond was formed between them, based on shared experiences and suffering. And although there were difficult days ahead, she knew that now she had someone who believed in her. Soon the ambulance left, and hope flared in her heart that everything could still change. Life was full of trials, but every step forward was an opportunity to leave fear and pain in the past. She knew that with each new day she would fight for her life and for those she loved. The ambulance, carrying the woman to safety, left behind a hellish scene that slowly faded in the rearview mirror. but her inner state remained in turmoil. Despite the physical pain and threat, she felt that in this moment something greater was awakening. It was a sense of struggle, survival, and a desire to change her life and the lives of others. When they arrived at the hospital, the air was filled with an unbearable mixture of disinfectant and the laughter of children waiting for their treatment. Images appeared in her mind, how her little grandchildren looked at her with curiosity, how they enjoyed her visits, and how her absence would affect their lives. These thoughts gave her strength, and she knew that she had to continue to fight not only for herself, but also for the future of her loved ones. But inside the hospital, she faced new challenges. The staff, busy with their own affairs, often ignored her suffering, failing to consider that she was not just another patient but a woman with a real story. Her racial bias was felt in every look, every movement. Doctors and nurses, working with her, could not hide their surprise and disdain. How did she end up like this? One of them whispered, standing by her bed. Their whispers were full of condemnation, as if it was her fault that her life had turned into hell. The woman heard every word, and with each new statement, her anger grew. She realized that even though she had just escaped death, there were still those in her life who considered her less valuable than others. When the doctor arrived, he quickly said the standard phrases, but there was not a drop of sympathy in his voice. She noticed how he occasionally glanced at her documents, not interested in her condition. "You need a lot of rest," he said, addressing her with such an indifferent intonation, as if he were talking to an object and not a person. "We will do everything possible to make you recover." It was so unbearable. Her heart sank in pain as she realized that she was nothing more than a statistic to them. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words stuck in her throat. Fear and anger mixed together, creating a hurricane inside. "You don't even know who I am," she screamed, her voice low and frantic. "I'm not just a number in your system. I'm a person." The doctor frowned, but instead of answering, he simply walked away, leaving her alone with her fears and prejudices. She felt isolated and alone in this alien world. The shadows of prejudice continued to haunt her, and this increased her pain. Soon her medicine was brought to her, and as the nurse approached her bed, she felt a cold touch, as if she was being looked at with distrust. The woman looked up and met the nurse's gaze, which was filled with disdain and fear. "I hope you know that your lifestyle and your behavior have led to this," the nurse said with a slight smile. "Maybe you should think about how you live." Each word she said sounded like a blow to the heart. The woman, in tears but full of determination, answered, "I don't have to justify myself to you. My life is my life, and I have the right to protect it, despite what you think." Her voice was full of passion, but the nurse only curled her lips and continued her work, ignoring her. The woman felt fear creeping up again. Anger inside her grew as she realized that even in this sacred place where there should be care and compassion, racism continued to reign. Every word, every movement was like a new insult, like a cold shower that plunged her into a world where she was always different. And this differentness became a heavy burden from which she could not escape. She couldn't stay silent any longer. Her feelings were overwhelming, and she decided she had to speak. This battle wouldn't end until she could express how she truly felt. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, gathering her strength. "I am not a victim," she said loudly, with determination. "I am a survivor, and I have a right to my story." Her words echoed throughout the room, filling it with strength. She decided that she would fight for her place in this world, despite all the prejudice and hatred. This fight, this story, her story, was just beginning. With every minute she spent in the hospital, the woman felt her inner world turning into a battle. Her body was wounded, but it was the prejudice she faced that hurt her even more. She knew that recovery would require not only physical strength, but also mental fortitude. She had to learn to fight not only the burns, but also the hatred that the world around her was creating. That evening, as the room grew dark, she was overcome by thoughts of what was happening outside her little world. Soon she would have to face not only recovery, but also those who would judge her by the color of her skin. The fear was unbearable, and she began to feel it growing inside her like a dark shadow. Hours later, when she finally tried to sleep, she was awakened by a loud noise outside the room. The conversations and laughter that had been bothering her pierced her. She tried to figure out what was going on, and soon noticed groups of nurses and doctors walking past her room, talking about something that didn't concern her. 80% burns, one of the nurses said, her voice full of indifference. She won't survive. The words were like sharp knives piercing her soul. She felt the world around her blurring, and with each new word of hatred her heart grew heavier. How could they discuss her life so easily? She had become an object again, in something more terrible than her physical wounds. The woman clenched her fists, trying to contain the anger that was building. This fear, this humiliation, all these prejudices, they were becoming a part of her life. But she couldn't let them win. Not now. Not after everything she'd been through. The next day, when the doctor came to see her, her feelings were filled with anger again. She noticed how he easily ignored her requests for additional help, as if her condition did not matter. He referred to her medical records and the time it would take for her to recover, without showing an ounce of empathy. "Your rehabilitation will be long," he said, leafing through her papers as if he were talking to a soulless machine. "We'll do everything we can, but you have a lot of difficulties." The woman looked at him, and a fire flared in her eyes. She couldn't stand this indifference. The forces that were taking hold of her reminded her that she was not alone. She thought of her grandchildren, of her family, and this thought helped her find words. "I'm not just a statistic," she shouted, interrupting his speech. "I deserve respect and humanity. I'm not just a number in your system." The doctor stopped, his eyes widening in surprise. He looked unsure, but then he went back to his paperwork, trying to ignore her words. But she wasn't going to give in. "I'm here, and I'm going to fight for my life," she continued, each word filled with determination. "You have to see me as a person, not a victim. I know this isn't just treatment, it's life." A shadow of understanding flashed in his gaze, but it was gone. The doctor, unable to withstand the pressure, left the room, leaving her with a dull feeling of being unacknowledged. The woman understood that this was not just her fight. It was the fight of everyone who had ever encountered prejudice and hatred. At that moment, a nurse entered the room and, despite her prejudice, showed her a small drop of compassion. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said, not looking him in the eye, as if afraid her words would not be received. "Why can't they understand that I'm human?" the woman asked, her voice shaking with emotion. "Why are they only interested in the color of my skin?" "I know it's hard," the nurse replied, her voice soft and gentle. "A lot of people don't understand, but I believe you have the power to change that. You have to keep fighting to show them you're not just a victim." These words gave the woman hope. She couldn't afford to give up. She had to use her voice to confront bias, to change perceptions. This became her new goal, and she was ready to fight. A flame lit inside her, promising that this was not the end, but only the beginning of her journey to healing. She would fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who had suffered similar humiliations. She knew her fight would be long and difficult, but now she was ready for it. With each passing day in the hospital, the woman felt her resilience being tested more and more. Despite the support of several staff members, prejudice and hatred remained omnipresent. Her body was healing, but deeper in her mind, the storm continued to rage, and each day became a battle against demons that sought to destroy her spirit. One morning, a new group of doctors entered the room. They were talking loudly among themselves, discussing which of them would treat her. Their laughter was like an ominous chorus, and the woman felt a chill run through her. One of them, with a disdainful expression on his face, glanced in her direction. "She's not the first," he said, smiling ironically. "Black people always end up in situations like this. We shouldn't even be surprised that she's in the hospital again." Her heart sank at his words, and she felt the flames of hatred blaze inside her. She knew she couldn't let this go unnoticed. With every joke, with every derogatory comment, she became more vulnerable. "Are you all that careless?" she asked, her voice full of pain. "I'm a person, not just your entertainment." The doctors exchanged glances, and in their eyes she saw not only displeasure, but also open contempt. One of them, with a smirk on his face, said, "No need to react like that. You won't stay with us for long anyway. This whole thing with you is just a temporary phenomenon." The woman felt herself getting sick again. The words echoed all the humiliation she had endured throughout her life. She remembered being told as a child that she could not succeed, being rejected at school, having her dreams constantly dashed. It all came to the surface, and she felt she could no longer remain silent. "You can't understand what this is like," she said, her voice shaking. "I survived the fire, and now that I'm here, I deserve respect." Her words hung in the air, but as always, they only caused laughter. One of the medics, tall and thin, threw his head back and laughed loudly. "Please don't make yourself a victim. It doesn't help, as if it will change your skin color or your status in society." Every word they said was like a knife piercing her heart. She felt like she was paying for her mistakes, and it was unbearable. Rage flared up inside her, but with it came hopelessness. She knew that these people would speak as they wanted, and that she would not be able to change their attitude. And yet, she decided not to give up. A thought entered her mind. Her suffering had to have a meaning. She had to use this horror to reach out to others, to change this world. This became her new calling. When the doctors left, she was left alone with her thoughts. A determination arose within her. She had to tell her story. Every word of hate she heard had to be transformed into power, into a voice that would be heard. Her burns had become not only physical suffering, but also a symbol of struggle. That afternoon, when she was feeling a little better, she decided to reach out to the social workers who came to the hospital. She knew they could help her voice reach people who could do something about these prejudices. When she asked to meet, one of the social workers, a middle-aged woman, nodded understandingly. "I can see that it's important for you to be heard," she said, her voice full of respect. "We can work together to get your story out there." It was a ray of hope for her. The woman spoke about her experiences, about how she faces prejudice, hatred, humiliation every day. She shared her memories, her fears, and her determination. "I want people to understand that racism is not just a word. It's a life we lead. It's a fight we fight every day," she said, "and I don't want that to continue." The social worker listened carefully, and his eyes filled with compassion. He knew that her story was important and that it could be the start of something bigger. Soon, they began to develop a plan to highlight her experience. But even as she prepared to tell her story, she knew that there would be even more brutal trials ahead. She sensed that the racism she would face would be more overt and aggressive. Every time she thought about how hard it would be to begin this fight, fear gripped her, but at the same time, a fire of determination blazed within her. She decided that this fight had to be hers. She had to speak out not just for herself, but for all those who could not speak. This became her new goal, and she was ready for it, despite everything that was yet to come. With each passing day, the woman became more deeply immersed in her struggle. The inner fire she had ignited became her guiding light, but a new threat loomed on the horizon. Her voices became audible, but the hatred she was trying to overcome only grew stronger. A few days later, the doctors came to her room again. This time there were more of them, and the atmosphere was tense. She felt the air grow cold behind her, and at that moment her instincts kicked in. She saw something sinister in the eyes of one of them, something that filled her with horror. They were whispering to each other, as if discussing something concerning her. "Why is she even here?" one of them said, looking at her with disdain. "Perhaps she is to blame for her condition. Not worth wasting your time on." Another chimed in. "Black women are usually too hysterical to know what they really need." The words were like hammer blows, shattering her confidence. She closed her eyes to block out their faces, and in that moment she felt like she was losing control of the situation. All her efforts seemed futile, like she was caught in a vortex of hatred with no way out. Before they had left, she decided to intervene. Her voice carried a force she had not expected. "I'm not here to serve your amusement," she cried, her words echoing in the room. "I deserve respect and help." One of the doctors, the one who had looked at her with disdain, just smirked and stared at her as if she were something incomprehensible. "You are in no position to demand anything," he said, looking around the room as if he despised its existence. "Know your place." A hurricane of emotions flared up inside her. Every look he gave her, every word he said, only intensified the very pain she was trying to forget. A loud scream rang out in her soul. She wanted everyone to hear her suffering, to understand what it was like to be judged just because of the color of your skin. But her cries went unanswered. Instead, she felt the shadow of hatred hanging over her. Unable to bear the burden, she felt alone again, as if her life were just part of a hideous spectacle. The next day, she was moved to another ward, where the conditions were worse. she noticed that she was being treated with even more disdain than before. Doctors and nurses passed by, paying no attention to her. They talked among themselves, not hesitating to joke about her situation, as if her suffering had become a form of entertainment for them. "How is it that she is still alive?" one of them said. "This is simply ridiculous." Each word was like a blow to her heart, and she felt tears welling up in her eyes again. In that moment, she realized that her fight was not just a fight for recovery, it was a fight for her self-determination, for the right to be heard. That night, when the hospital was quiet, she made a decision. She wrote a letter in which she laid out all her worries. Every word, every sentence became an act of resistance. She knew that this letter might not reach anyone important, but it would be her cry for help. "I can't be silent when there's so much evil going on around me," she wrote. "I can't stay in the shadows when the world needs the truth." Like a spell, her letter became her weapon. It was filled not only with her pain, but also with hope for change. She wanted those who read it to understand that racism was not just a word, but a reality she lived through every day. However, her struggle was getting worse. That same night, 2 men in uniform entered her room. They were guards, and they looked at her with disdain. "It turns out that some doctors are complaining about you," one of them said, crossing his arms over his chest. "You talk too much." "I just want to be heard," she replied, her voice filled with strong intent. "I have the right to speak of my suffering." They only smirked in response, and one of the guards stepped closer, his eyes blazing with hatred. "We know how to deal with you," he said menacingly. "If you don't calm down, we'll have to do something to make you understand your place." The woman's heart began to beat faster as she realized that she was in real danger. These were not just words. This was a threat that could become reality. She felt a chill run down her spine, and in that moment, fear consumed her. "You have no right to treat me like this," she screamed, but her voice sounded weak, as if all her strength had been taken away. The guards just chuckled, and one of them said, "And you still think your words matter? Calm down, or we'll make sure you understand that you have no power." With that, they walked out, leaving her alone in the darkness. She felt her world crumbling again. The pain, the prejudice, the fear, all of it weighed on her like an unbearable burden. She knew she had to keep fighting, but now that her life was at stake, she found it hard to maintain her confidence. The silence of the room fell upon her, and she finally began to understand. This fight could cost her life. Every step she took forward was surrounded by the shadow of fear and hatred, but inside her, a flame still burned, a spark of hope that one day the world could change. The woman clenched her fists, and in that moment she decided that she would not let fear defeat her. She would fight, even if it meant facing the darkness itself. Night had fallen over the hospital, and the silence seemed even more oppressive than before. The woman felt her fears and worries rolling over her like waves, giving her no peace. Every whisper outside the walls of the ward sounded like an ominous harbinger of something terrible that she could not avoid. The next morning, the group of doctors gathered in the room again, and the woman felt a chill run down her spine. They discussed her among themselves, ignoring her. One of them, the same doctor with the disdain she had encountered before, again took the lead. "That black granny is back?" he asked with disdain, causing his colleagues to laugh. How is it that she is still alive after everything that happened to her? Her heart sank with humiliation, and she felt rage rising inside her. She wasn't just a black grandmother, she was a woman with a history, with dreams and hopes. But these people were blind to her suffering. They saw only the color of her skin, which made them feel disgusted. Why waste time on her at all? Another doctor chimed in, his voice sounding indifferent. She's not destined to change. She'll always stay the way she is. Listening to them, she thought of her ancestors, how they had fought for survival, how they had to overcome prejudice and racism. These thoughts filled her with strength, but she also realized that she would have to face even deeper and more brutal forms of hatred. At that moment, a guard entered the room, the same one who had threatened her the day before. His face was distorted with anger, and the fire of hatred burned in his eyes. "What's going on here?" he asked, looking at the doctors. "Why does she still dare to be here?" The woman felt her chest tighten with fear. She knew that these were not just words. He was ready to go to extremes to show her her place. "She's just wasting our time," one of the doctors said, looking at her with disdain. "She'd be better off just shutting up." "I won't let you humiliate me," she screamed, her voice shaking with rage and fear. "I have a right to be here, and I have a right to live." The guard smirked, his face expressing contempt. "If you don't calm down, I can make you really feel what pain is," he said, moving closer to her. Her body tensed as he stepped closer, but she couldn't back down. A fire ignited inside her. She knew she had to keep fighting. She wasn't alone, she was supported by the stories of those who had fought before her. "You can't scare me," she said with great determination, trying to suppress her fear. But the guard only grinned, as if her words were just a game to him. "You don't understand that this is more than a threat," he said, leaning toward her, his breath cold. "I can make you wish you were never born." She felt cold sweat running down her back, and in that moment it became clear to her that the world around her was filled with hatred. Her own life, her struggles, had become a game for those who did not understand what it was like to be her. That same night, she was moved again to another ward, where conditions were even worse and the medical staff even more prejudiced. Every day, she encountered new forms of racism, which manifested itself in jokes, disdainful looks, and offensive comments. She felt hatred fill her days, and fear became her constant companion. Every morning she woke up thinking about how hard it would be to find the strength to continue. She knew this was her last battle. She couldn't let racism cloud her spirit, but it was becoming harder every day. Every look, every whisper, every smile filled with contempt weighed on her like a heavy stone. Despite this, she decided not to give up. She began writing down her experiences in a diary, which she hid under her mattress. These words became her only consolation, and in them she sought the strength to continue the fight. Each page was filled not only with her suffering, but also with the hope that one day someone would understand her. "I'm not alone," she whispered to herself, looking into the mirror. "I represent everyone who fights prejudice. I have to be strong for them." And in those dark days, when fear and hatred were her only companions, she knew that her story mattered. Every moment of struggle, every humiliation, every insult was part of a journey that she hoped would one day change the world. But a new threat was waiting for her ahead, not only from the guards and doctors, but also from the system itself, which seemed merciless to her. Her desire to change the situation and continue the fight became even more urgent, and she understood that her story was not over yet. She was ready for a new battle, despite all the fears and all the suffering. The woman sat in her room, studying every crack in the walls as if they held the truth about her fate. The sky outside was gray, and the light that broke through the clouds looked as dim as her hope. Every day, the fight against prejudice became more and more exhausting, but a fire burned inside her that did not allow her to give up. She knew that she had to continue, despite all the difficulties. That day, the hospital became the scene of a new, more terrible reality. Voices were heard in the corridor, loud, contemptuous, full of hatred. The woman listened, and in her heart there was a feeling that the conversations concerned her. "Blacks always act like they can do anything," one of the doctors said, laughing at his own joke. "She must be having some problems again. Do we still have to take care of her?" Another one chimed in. "So what? She's a grandma who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Let her handle it herself." The words were like blows, each one rousing her anger and disappointment. Her life, her suffering, none of it mattered to them. They didn't see her as a person, only as the color of her skin, which they despised. As if in response to her internal struggle, the door to the ward swung open and a guard walked in. His face was filled with malice, and she felt her heart freeze in fear. "Are you still here?" he said, leaning against the door frame. "I thought you were finally going to disappear." The woman tried to muster the strength to respond, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she simply stared at him, full of hatred and contempt. "What do you want?" she asked, trying to sound confident, but inside her an ocean of fear was raging. "I've come to remind you," he said, approaching, "that we will not tolerate you walking this corridor any longer. You are simply a mistake, and it is time to realize it." She knew she should answer, but her voice shook and she felt everything inside her twist with despair. "I'm not a mistake," she screamed, her voice piercing the silence. "I'm a human being, and I deserve respect." The guard just smirked in response, his face distorted with anger. "You think your words matter?" he said, leaning closer, his breath hot and aggressive. "We can make you understand what it's like to be truly humiliated." His words filled her with fear, and she felt a shudder run through her body. She knew this man was not joking. His hatred and contempt were real, and in that moment it became clear to her that she could not count on help. She was alone against a system that was against her. That night, when the hospital lights went out, the woman decided to take her fate into her own hands. She began to write. Her words became her salvation, but this time they were filled not only with fear, but also with determination. She wrote about her experiences, how racism manifested itself in her every day, how hatred, oppression, and prejudice were destroying her soul. "I'm not alone," she whispered like a mantra as she continued to write. "I represent everyone who suffers as I do." Each line was filled with bitterness, but there was also a sense of hope. She dreamed of the day when her words would be heard, that someone would finally understand her suffering. Tired of constant humiliation and isolation, she wrote about the importance of being strong. She encouraged others to not give up despite all the dark days and prejudices. The next morning, when she faced the medical staff again, she was prepared. The doctor began to joke with her again, but she raised her head, full of determination. "You can laugh at me, but I'm here to tell my story," she said loudly, her voice resonating in the hallway. "I'm not just a black grandma. I'm a person with a story, and my words matter." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment there was silence. She saw the surprise on the faces of the doctors and guards, and in that moment she realized that maybe her voice could actually make a difference. But still, her fear remained. She knew that this fight was not over. Every day she faced new challenges, but the fire inside her still burned. She was not going to give up, even when the world around her seemed insane. In the end, her story wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who had ever suffered from racism, prejudice, and hatred. She fought not only for herself, but for everyone who had no voice. And in that, she found her strength. The morning began as before, with dim light filtering through the curtains of the ward. The woman rose from her bed, determined to continue the fight. She knew that every day would be like the last, but now she had a plan. She would no longer remain silent. Several patients had gathered in the woman's dining room for breakfast, and among them she noticed several black women her age. Each looked tired and depressed, as if the weight of prejudice and racism was weighing on them. The woman felt a burning desire to bring them together, to let them know they were not alone. "Hello," she said, approaching the table where the women were sitting. "How are you feeling today?" They looked at her in surprise, and then one of them, a woman with gray hair and deeply tanned skin, answered, "I'm just trying to get through the day like everyone else." "You are not alone," she said, her voice full of confidence. "We have each other, and we must support each other." The other women looked at each other, and she felt a spark of hope in their eyes. They began sharing their stories of their experiences in the hospital, of being humiliated and ignored. Each of them told stories of their own battles with bias, of how they had to deal with racism not only from the medical staff but from those around them. She understood that each story was not just a testimony of pain, but also a step toward liberation. They talked about their suffering, and with each word the tension in the air lessened. The woman realized that right now, when they shared their experiences, they became stronger. At that moment, she realized that they were united not only by the color of their skin, but also by a common struggle for dignity. She raised her cup of tea and said, "Let's unite. We can be the voice of change. If we speak out and share our suffering, we will be heard." The women looked at her in surprise, and then one of them, a young woman with bright eyes, asked, "How can we do this?" "We can start here," she said, gesturing toward the hospital walls. "Each of us has the right to be heard. We must write our stories and share them. We can create our own movement." One by one, the women began to nod, a spark of hope shining in their eyes. In that moment, they all realized that their struggle should not go unnoticed. Each of them had the right to have their story heard. They had to fight not only for themselves, but also for those who cannot speak. When lunch was over, the woman returned to her room, full of determination. She quickly pulled out her journal and began writing. Each stroke of her pen became an expression of strength and resilience. She wrote down how important it was to be strong for each other and how their stories could help change the world. She wrote about racism, about bias, about hatred, and how they could confront it all together. Meanwhile, the guard reappeared in the hallway, his anger evident. He looked at the woman as she wrote and frowned. "What are you doing here?" he asked with disdain. "Writing about how you were being humiliated?" "I'm writing about my experiences," she answered confidently, raising her head. "And you can't stop it." He started to approach, but she was not afraid. She felt how the support of her new friends became part of her strength. "Do you think your hatred can break me?" she said. "I am not alone, and we will fight." Her words shocked the guard. He paused for a moment, and doubt flashed in his eyes. But then, as if throwing off a mask, he returned to his contempt. "You think you can make a difference in this world?" he said mockingly. "You're just an old black granny." But instead of giving up, she embraced her resolve, her heart swelling with pride. She knew that every fight mattered, that every word she spoke was a step toward change. "I'm not just a grandmother," she said with confidence. "I'm a woman who deserves respect. I'm the voice of those you try to silence." At that moment, the guard turned around and walked out of the room, leaving her with the feeling that she had taken an important step towards victory. The woman returned to her journal and continued writing. She knew that this would be a difficult path, and that new challenges lay ahead. But she was not alone now. She was part of a movement, part of a community that was striving for change. And with every word she wrote, she felt her strength grow. She knew that one day her voice would be heard, and it would give hope to many who also suffered from racism and prejudice. And that hope became her inspiration, her motivation to continue fighting. The woman continued to write in her diary, her words becoming more powerful and insightful. Every morning she rose earlier than the other patients so that she could spend time thinking and writing down her thoughts. With each new page, her story took on new colors, and her experiences became not just a personal tragedy, but a manifesto for the fight for justice. The desire to create something bigger began to emerge among the women she met in the cafeteria. They began to gather together, sharing their stories and ideas. Each time they met, the atmosphere became more tense, but hopeful. The women discussed how they could advance their ideas beyond the hospital, how to draw attention to their problems. "We can organize support groups," one of the women suggested. "It will help us find like-minded people and come together to share our stories and ideas." "Yes, and we can use social media," added another. "Our story needs to be heard. If we share our experiences online, maybe someone will understand and support us." These discussions lit a spark within them. Each of the women realized that they were part of something bigger, a community that could make an impact on society. It was a community built on mutual support and understanding, and they grew stronger every day. One day, as they were discussing their ideas, one of the women noticed the guard walking past again. This made them feel uneasy, but instead of being scared, they decided that this was an opportunity. "Let's show him that we're not afraid," the woman said, and her words became the decisive moment. They collected their stories and decided to put them on display. The women prepared a short presentation in which they described their experiences and the challenges they faced. They wanted the guard to see them as people, not as the stereotypes he was used to perceiving. When the day of the presentation arrived, the women gathered in one of the hospital's common rooms. They felt the excitement building, but at the same time, their confidence in their abilities was growing. Each of them was ready to share their story, and each story was full of pain, but also hope. The moment they began to speak, their sincerity and strength caught everyone's attention. The woman who first took the stage spoke of her fears, of how her racism and prejudice had oppressed her for years. "I didn't come here to be a victim," she said. "I came here to be a voice for change. We all deserve respect and equality." After her speech, other women followed her, each story becoming more compelling. They spoke of their dreams, their hopes, and their willingness to fight for their rights. When the guard entered the hall, he stopped when he heard their voices. At first, he was dismissive, but gradually his confidence began to waver. He did not expect to see such unity and strength in these women. A woman standing on the stage noticed him and addressed him. "We are here to show that we are not just the color of our skin. We are people with dreams and rights, just like you." Her words pierced the air, and the guard froze for a moment. He felt doubt growing in him, and changes began to occur inside him. He did not know how to react, and this conflict in his inner world was obvious. After the presentation, when the women returned to their table, they felt as if they had accomplished something great. They knew it was only the first step, but it became a symbol of their unity and determination. The woman sat down again to write her diary, and this time her words were full of hope and confidence. She wrote about how they now had the opportunity to change their fate and the fate of others. Each line she wrote became not only a testimony to the struggle, but also a manifesto of change. She knew there would be challenges and obstacles ahead, but together with other women, they could overcome anything. They became the voice of their generation, and this was only the beginning of their journey. After the successful presentation, the women felt energized and hopeful. They began planning their next steps, deciding that their fight should not be limited to the hospital walls. They wanted their voices to be heard outside, in a society that often ignored issues of racism and bias. The woman who had become the informal leader of the group suggested holding an outdoor rally. It was risky, but she knew that if they wanted to be heard, they had to get out there and make their voices heard. "We have to choose the right place," she said during one of the meetings. "It has to be where as many people as possible will see us." "A park in the city center is the ideal place," the other women agreed, and soon they began collecting materials for posters and leaflets. They discussed what to write to make their messages clear and powerful. Each of them tried to contribute, adding their own thoughts and experiences. "Our goal is not only to tell our stories," said one of the women, "but also to draw attention to the problems we face every day." The woman felt her heart fill with pride that they had become one. They were no longer just victims, they had become activists fighting for their rights and the rights of others. The day of the rally arrived and excitement filled the air. They arrived at the park with signs that read slogans such as "We have the right to be heard," and "Racism is not a joke." The women gathered in a circle, hugged and gave each other encouraging words as they prepared for what lay ahead. As they began to rally, their voices became a chorus, speaking in unison. They shared their stories, and their words were full of emotion, pain, and, most importantly, hope for change. They were joined by passers-by who, hearing their cries, began to stop and listen. Some of them started shouting out their own stories, and soon the rally became multi-ethnic. People of different races, genders and ages gathered to support the women who were fighting so hard for justice. It was a stunning sight to see them unite their voices in one movement. However, not everything went smoothly. Suddenly, groups of people who did not support their movement appeared from around the corner. The security guard who was present at the rally stood to the side, watching the events with a sneer. Some of these people began shouting insults and threats, trying to intimidate those who had come to support the women. "Get out of here, you don't belong in our city," one of the men shouted, pointing his finger at them. "You're just disgracing us." The woman felt a tremor of anxiety in her heart, but she couldn't let fear get the better of her. Instead, she raised her sign higher, calling attention to their cause. "We are here to speak the truth," she cried. "We will not leave until we are heard." Her words echoed around the park and people began to cheer her on. The women standing nearby also raised their signs and began chanting in response to the attacks. The situation became increasingly tense, and fear gripped the crowd as the confrontation began to escalate. But then something incredible happened. Other groups of people who had come to the rally began to form a defense of the women, creating a chain of support. "We stand together," someone from the crowd shouted. "There will be no hatred." The woman felt her heart fill with pride and she knew they were not alone. It was a moment of unity she would never forget. As the crowd began to chant and the sounds of protests mingled with the music, the security guard watching the whole thing suddenly saw his own preconceived notions begin to crumble. He realized that these women were not just insignificant characters, they were a force that demanded respect. Suddenly he realized that he himself had to change his attitude. Faced with such power and determination, he could no longer remain on the sidelines. The woman on the stage felt the change in the air. She knew their protest was not in vain. They were not just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for the future, for the world to be a fairer place for everyone. And in that moment, as they sang and chanted, she realized that their story was not just one of suffering and struggle, but also one of hope, of change being possible if they kept moving forward, without retreating or giving in. The rally was a landmark moment, and they knew it was just the beginning of their journey to change. They were uniting, raising their voices, and becoming part of a movement that could change society. With this new strength, with a new understanding of themselves and their capabilities, they were ready for the next step. If you liked this story, please write in the comments what you think about it. Have you ever experienced racism in your life? Your opinions and stories are very important to us, and we value each of you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it if you want to see more stories like this. Thanks for joining us and have a great day.